What's going on, creeps? It's Doc here. I know usually we just cut to the straight goods, but this is a special release we're doing here. This is a project we've been working on for a while. You may hate it. Let us know if you do. Bombard us with your hate. We can take it. But this is an abridged, kind of more accessible version of the Call of Cthulhu that we've been working on. So I hope you enjoy it.
The most merciful thing in life, I think, is the inability of the mind to connect all of its contents. We live on a peaceful island of ignorance, amongst a raging sea of infinity. And we were not meant to voyage far from that shore. The sciences, each leaning in their own direction, have done little harm, but someday we will unlock that Pandora's box. We shall either go mad from such a revelation, or flee from the light of truth into the peace and safety of a new dark age. The most learned spiritual figures can only guess at the awesome cosmic cycle that our world is part of. They have hinted at some strange aspects of existence which would freeze the blood of any man. But it is not this that granted me a glimpse of forbidden aeons, such horrors that drove me to the brink of madness. That glimpse, like all fleeting glimpses of horrible truths, resulted from the accidental piecing together of information. In this case, newspaper articles and notes from a dead professor. I only hope that no one else will imitate my investigations. I think, too, that the professor would have destroyed these notes, had his death not been so sudden. It all began during the winter of 1926 to 1927, after the death of my great-uncle George Gamel Angel, professor of semantic languages at Brown University. He was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions, and had often been called upon by prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 was common knowledge. Most were interested by his mysterious cause of death. A man had bumped into the professor after both were exiting a boat in Newport. He fell suddenly down a hill to his death. Onlookers described the assailant as a nautical-looking black man, who had disappeared into the dark alley of William Street. Physicians were unable to find anything other than an obscure lesion of the heart that assumed was caused by his age and the impact of the fall. At the time, I didn't argue with the diagnosis, but I am now inclined to wonder, and more than wonder. My great-uncle was left childless and unmarried. I was both his heir and executor, so I was expected to go over his will and research, so I brought them to my office in Boston. Some of the material will appear in the American Archaeology Society. The second box was far more puzzling, which I prudently decided to keep secret. The box was locked, and it was not until I remembered the ring my great-uncle always kept in his pocket that I made a breakthrough. This allowed me to finally open the box, but also confronted me with the greatest mystery of all. All I found inside was some wood cuttings, cryptic writings, and a clay statue. Perplexed, I wondered what my uncle had been studying in his final days. I had decided to start with the sculpture in my investigation. The clay figure was a rectangle, less than an inch thick and about 5 by 6 inches in area, which had been manufactured recently. Its designs, however, were far from modern. The aesthetics suggested a far more arcane atmosphere, and the writings too seemed to be arcane, though my education and evaluation of the papers have far from explained the species of the figure sculpted in clay. Above these apparent hieroglyphics was a depiction of a figure that was beyond any art I'd ever encountered. It seemed to be some sort of monster or symbol representing one, which only the most perverse minds could conceive. My imagination yielded the simultaneous images of an octopus, dragon, and a human caricature. This was as far as my mind could venture. A pulpy head atop a grotesque and scaled body with rudimentary wings, but the general outline was what made it so shocking. Behind the figure was the faintest suggestion of ancient architecture. The writings which accompanied the images were nearly indecipherable, lacking any literary style. What seemed to be the main document was titled Cthulhu Cult, written in painstaking detail. They were divided into 2 sections. The first was headed 1925, Dream and Dream Work of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island, New Orleans, Louisiana at 1908, AAA meeting. Notes on same and Professor Webb's account. The other papers were brief notes. Some of them accounts of the queer dreams, some citations from theosophical books and magazines focusing on secret societies, and hidden cults which reference mythological and anthropological texts. The woodcuttings portrayed morbidity, mental illness, and outbreaks of mania in the spring of 1925. The first half of the manuscript told a peculiar tale. Apparently, a thin, dark, anxious young man called upon Professor Angel with the clay sculpture, which was still damp and fresh. He introduced himself as Henry Anthony Wilcox, whose family my uncle had recognized. The young man attended the Rhode Island School of Design and lived in an apartment nearby. He was a precocious youth, known for his genius but also for his eccentricities from a young age. Locally popular as a youth for his penchant for telling strange stories and odd dreams to anyone who would listen. He'd called himself psychically hypersensitive, but the inhabitants of the stodgy old town merely referred to him as queer. Never a socialite as he grew older, Henry had disappeared from the public eye. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to retain their conservative public image, found him to be quite hopeless. On meeting my great-uncle, Henry had instantly inquired any archaeological insight that pertained to the clay sculpture. My uncle was skeptical, and with some bluntness responded that the figure had little to nothing to do with archaeology. To which the young man shot back, "It is indeed new, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities more ancient than the contemplating Sphinx." It was then he began a rambling tale which awoke a sleeping memory, and won over the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake the night before, the first real one New England had in ages, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring to bed, he had an unprecedented dream of the ancient city, with ancient architecture of titanic blocks and monoliths that touched the sky, all dripping with green ooze and a singularly sinister aura. Hieroglyphics covered the walls and pillars, and from some unknown origin came a voice that was not a voice at all, a chaotic sensation only translatable into sound by intuition. But he nonetheless attempted to pronounce the jumble of letters that read, Cthulhu Fatan. The verbal jumble was the key to the recollection, which both excited and deeply disturbed my uncle. He questioned Wilcox with the most scientific thoroughness, and studied the sculpture with frantic intensity. The young man told my uncle that he had been promised eternal glory in exchange for joining some widespread, mystical or pagan religious sect. After an onslaught of questions on lore related to such cults, my uncle realized Wilcox was completely oblivious, demanding any information from future dreams. This bore some fruit. Digging into the manuscript, I saw almost daily correspondences from Wilcox, which told of dreams depicting the same cyclopean city, the dripping putrescence, and the voice, or intelligence, shouting more enigmatic gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters Cthulhu and Rile. On March 23rd, the manuscript continued that Wilcox had failed to appear. After some inquiries, my uncle discovered he had some obscure fever and was staying with his family. He was found screaming in his flat, and had only been in states of unconsciousness and delirium ever since. My uncle called the family, and kept a close eye on the case with Dr. Toby, who was the family's physician. The doctor could not stop shuddering as he told of young Wilcox's delusions, which my uncle had heard many times before. Except for a gargantuan figure which lumbered above the city, Wilcox believed it was the same creature he'd sculpted in clay. The doctor went on to explain his strange physical condition. Despite his normal temperature, he showed all of the telltale signs of fever rather than a mental disorder. On April 2nd at about midday, all of Wilcox's symptoms suddenly ceased. He sat upright in bed, astonished to find that he was at home with no memory of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March 22nd. Cleared by his physician 3 days later and returned to his squalid quarters. All traces of the strange dreams had vanished with his recovery, and after a week's worth of mundane dreams, my uncle gave up on him altogether. This ended the first segment of the manuscript. The rest were scattered notes of others who had similar dreams in this time period. My uncle had clearly exhausted all of his contacts in order to find these subjects, most of which led him nowhere. A majority of his peers saw his endeavor as nothing more than nonsense, although there were 4 cases of individuals who had dreams of strange landscapes in the same time frame as Wilcox. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that panic would have spread if they had been able to compare their experience as my uncle had. From the period of February 28th until April 2nd, these vivid dreams would run rampant, the majority taking place during the time Mr. Wilcox had his dreams. All of the victims seeming to have died several months later, living in a state of paranoid mania. I went on to the press cuttings, which touched on cases of panic and wild eccentricities through the ages. There was one about a night suicide in London where a lone sleeper had leapt from a third-story window with nothing more than a shriek as a goodbye. Another was a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic predicts a dire future from visions he'd seen. A dispatch from California describes a colony of fanatics who donned white robes for some glorious fulfillment which never arrives. Whilst in India there were always cases of native unrest toward the end of March. Voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti, and African outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes especially bothersome around this time of year, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical foreigners annually from March 22nd to the 23rd. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumors. And so many recorded incidents inside insane asylums, it was a miracle that no one had been able to correlate these events. All this information left me with only one certainty, that Wilcox had indeed known of the secrets my uncle had investigated from nothing more than his dreams.
Hey creeps, Doc here. Just welcoming you to part 2 of my chopped and cut Call of Cthulhu. Just want to thank you for giving this as much support and attention as it's received. Hope you enjoy this part as much as you enjoyed the first part. I got Bisbee back on here to read this because it got such good reception. And please just hit like, hit subscribe. Once we get up to 200 followers, part 3 will be up. Enjoy, creeps.
The older matters that crafted the sculptor's dream and sculpture were the chief components of my uncle's rambling manuscript. Once my uncle had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity, the alien hieroglyphics, and syllables which can be rendered only as Cthulhu, creating such a horrible connection that it is no wonder he pursued young Wilcox. The earlier experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis, where my uncle played a prominent part. He was one of the first to be approached by the outsiders who came to ask questions in hopes of expert answers. One outsider soon became the focus of the entire meeting, an ordinary-looking middle-aged man who came all the way from New Orleans for certain information, which he could not obtain locally. His name was John Raymond LaGrasse, an inspector of police. With him he bore a grotesque, repulsive, and very ancient-looking statuette, whose origin he desired to obtain. Inspector LaGrasse hadn't the least interest in archaeology. On the contrary, his wish for enlightenment was strictly professional. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured months before in the wooded swamps south of New Orleans during a raid of a voodoo meeting. So hideous were the rites connected with it that the police could not help realize they had stumbled upon some dark cult. Of its origin, apart from the unbelievable tales told by captured members, there was nothing. Hence the anxiety of the police for any antiquarian lore which might help them to place the frightful symbol and track down the cult source. Inspector LaGrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the men of science into tense excitement. Losing no time in crowding around to gaze at the figure whose utter strangeness and air of antiquity hinted so potently to unknown realms. No recognized technique had animated this terrible object, yet centuries and thousands of years seemed to have passed over the greenish surface. The figure, which was finally passed slowly from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 and 8 inches in height and of exquisitely artistic workmanship. It represented a monster with an octopus-like head, whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, razor-like claws on hind and fore feet, and long, narrow wings behind it. With its fearsome and unnatural malignancy, bloated and squatted on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undecipherable characters. The tips of the wings touched the back edge of the block. The seat occupied the center. The head was bent forward so that the ends of the facial feelers brushed the backs of huge forepaws on the crouch's knees. On the whole, it was abnormally lifelike. all the more frightful due to its source being totally unknown. Its vast, incalculable age was unmistakable, yet not one link to any form of archaic art forms. Its very material was a mystery, for the soapy greenish-black stone with its golden flecks and striations resembling nothing familiar in mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling. Despite a representation of half the world's expert learning in this field, no member could form the least notion of even the remotest similarity. They, like the subject, belonged to something horribly distinct from mankind as we know it. Something suggestive of ancient cycles of life in which our conceptions play no part. As the members shook their heads and confessed defeat at the inspector's problem, there was one man in that gathering who sensed a bizarre familiarity in the monstrous shape and writing, who presently told with some diffidence of the odd trifle he knew. This person was the late William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology in Princeton University, and an explorer of no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland, in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth, and whilst high up on the West Greenland coast had encountered some tribe or cult of degenerate Eskimo, whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness. It was a faith of which other Eskimo knew little, and which they could not mention without shudders, saying that it had come down from ancient aeons before the world was made. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there were certain queer hereditary rituals to a supreme elder devil, and of this Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic copy from an aged wizard priest, expressing the sounds in Roman letters as best he knew how. But just now, most important was the fetish which this cult had cherished, around which they danced when the ore leapt high over the ice cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very crude sculpture, comprising of a hideous picture and some cryptic writing. And so far as he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all essence to the thing lying before the meeting. This was received with astonishment by the members, and proved doubly exciting to Inspector Legrasse. He began at once to bombard them with questions, having copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested. He sought the professor to remember the syllable to the best of his ability, followed by a comparison of detail, followed by an awed silence when detective and scientist agreed on the identity of the phrase uttered during the hellish rituals, which took place worlds apart. What both the Eskimo wizard and the Louisiana swamp priest had chanted to their kindred idols was something very like this when chanted aloud. Fingloi, mugloa, nugla, nufwa, Cthulhu rale, mugla, nugla, fukan. In this, Legrasse was more informed than Professor Webb, for several among his prisoners had repeated to him what older celebrants told them the words meant. This text went something like this. In his house at Riley, dead Cthulhu waits, dreaming. In response to a general and urgent demand, Inspector Legrasse related his experience with the swamp worshippers, a story to which I could see my uncle attached profound significance. It disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination among those who would be least expected to possess it. On November 1st, 1907, there came to the New Orleans police a frantic summons from the swamp and lagoon country. The squatters there, good-natured descendants of Lafayette's men, were in the grips of stark terror from an unknown horror in the night. It was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had known before, and some of their women and children had disappeared since the malevolent tom-tom had began its incessant beating. Far within the haunted woods where no dweller ventured, there were insane shouts, soul-chilling chants, and devil-dancing flames, and the people could stand it no more. The police, filling 2 carriages and an automobile, left in the late afternoon with the shivering squatter as a guide. At the end of the passable road they alighted, and for miles splashed on in silence, through the cypress woods where day never came. Ugly roots and hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them. At length the squatters' settlement, a miserable huddle of huts, hove in sight, and hysterical dwellers ran out to cluster around the bobbing lanterns. The muffled beats of tom-toms was now audible far, far ahead, and a curdling shriek came in intervals with the wind. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the endless forest night.
reluctant to be left alone again. Each one of the cowed squatters refused point blank to advance another inch toward the scene of unholy worship. So Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided toward those woods that none of them had ever trod before. The region entered by the police was one of exceptionally evil repute, unknown and untraversed by white men. There were legends of a hidden lake unseen by mortal sight, in which dwelt a huge, formless thing with luminous eyes, and squatters whispered that bat-winged devils flew up from caverns to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before D'Iberville, before La Salle, before the Indians, and before even the wholesome beasts of the woods. It was nightmare, and to see it was to die, but it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was on the outskirts of this abhorred area. Perhaps the very place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legrasse's men as they plowed on toward the red glare and the muffled tom-toms. Now and then the less organized ululation would cease, and from what seemed a well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices would rise in sing-song chant that hideous phrase or ritual. Fingloi Mugloa Nufa Cthulhu Rile Waga Nagal Fatan. Then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted, and 2 were shaken into a frantic cry which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. The grass dashed swamp water on the face of the fainted men, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized with horror. In a natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre in area, clear of trees and tolerably dry. On this now leapt and twisted a more indescribable horde of humanity than any but a Sime or an Angarola could paint. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, stood a great granite monolith, some 8 feet in height, on top of which rested the noxious carven statuette. From a circle of scaffolds set up at regular intervals with the monolith hung, head downward, the oddly marred bodies of the squatters who had disappeared. It was inside this circle that the worshippers jumped and roared, the general direction of the mass motion being from left to right in endless bacchanal between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire. It may have been only imagination, and it may have been only echoes which induced one of the men to fancy he heard responses to the ritual from some far and unilluminated spot deeper within the wood of ancient legend. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned, and he proved distractingly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of great wings, and of a glimpse of shining eyes and a mountainous white bulk beyond the trees. But I suppose he'd heard too much native superstition. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was of comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 entranced in the throng, the police relied on their firearms and plunged in determinedly. For 5 minutes the resulting chaos was beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made. But in the end, Legrasse was able to count some 47 sullen prisoners, whom he forced to dress in haste and fall into line between 2 rows of policemen. 5 of the worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded ones were carried away on improvised stretchers by their fellow prisoners. The image on the monolith, of course, was carefully removed and carried back by Legrasse. Examined at headquarters, the prisoners all proved to be men of a very mentally aberrant type. Most were seamen, largely West Indians or Brava Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands. Gave a coloring of voodooism to the cult. But before many questions were answered, it became manifest that something far deeper and older was involved. Degrading as they were, the men held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome faith. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones, who lived ages before there were any men, and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea. But their dead bodies had told their secrets and dreams to the first men, who formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult,
and the prisoners said it had always existed and always would exist. Hidden in distant, dark places all over the world until the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of R'lyeh, under the waters should rise. Someday he would call, when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conscious things of Earth's shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few. But these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The carven idol was great Cthulhu, but none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writings now, but things were told by word of mouth. The chanted ritual was not the secret. That was never spoken aloud, only whispered. The chant meant only this: in the house at R'lyeh, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged, and the rest were committed to various institutions. All denied a part in the ritual murders, swearing that the killing had been done by black winged ones, which had come to them in the haunted wood. But of those mysterious allies no coherent account could be gained. What the police did extract came mainly from an immensely aged mestizo named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that made men and the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been aeons when other things ruled on the earth, and they had great cities. Remains of them, he said, the deathless Chinamen had told him, was still to be found as cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died long before men came, but there were arts in which could revive them, when the stars had come round again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had indeed come themselves from the stars, and brought their images with them. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky, but when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of R'lyeh, preserved by the spells of the mighty Cthulhu for a glorious resurrection, when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time, some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserved them likewise prevented them from making an initial move, and they could only lie awake in the dark and think whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, but their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now they talked in their tombs. When after infinities of chaos, the first men came, the great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them in dreams. For only thus could their language reach the minds of mammals. Then those first men formed the cult around small idols which the great ones showed them. The cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priests would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of Earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves. Meanwhile, the cult must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. In the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams. But then something happened. The great stone city R'lyeh had sunken beneath the deep waters, through which not even thought can pass. This had cut off the spectral intercourse. But memory never died, and high priests said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits, moldy and shadowy, and full of dim rumors, picked up in caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of them old Castro dared not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones he curiously declined to mention. Of the cult, he said that the center lay in the pathless deserts of Arabia, and was virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted of it, though the deathless Chinaman said that there were double meanings in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred,
which the initiated might read as they chose, especially the much-discussed couplet, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die." Legrasse, deeply impressed and not a little bewildered, had inquired in vain concerning the historic affiliations to the cult. Castro apparently had told the truth when he said it was wholly secret. The authorities at Tulane University could shed no light upon either cult or image, and now the detective had come to the highest authorities in the country and met with no more than the Greenland tale of Professor Webb. Legrasse for some time lent the image to Professor Webb, but at the latter's death it was returned to him and remains in his possession, where I viewed it not long ago. It is truly a terrible thing, and unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox. That my uncle was excited by the tale of the sculptor I did not wonder, for what thoughts must arise upon hearing what Legrasse had learned of the cult? Of a sensitive young man who had dreamed not only the figure and exact hieroglyphics of the swamp-found image and the Greenland devil tablet, but had come in his dreams upon at least 3 of the precise words of the formula uttered alike by Eskimo diabolists and the cult members from Louisiana. Professor Engel's instant start on an investigation of the utmost thoroughness was eminently natural, though privately I suspect young Wilcox of having heard of the cult in some indirect way, and of having invented a series of dreams to heighten and continue the mystery at my uncle's expense. The dream narratives and cuttings collected by their professor were, of course, strong corroboration. But the extravagance of the whole subject led me to adopt what I thought the most sensible of conclusions. So after thoroughly studying the manuscript again and correlating the theosophical and anthropological notes with the cult narrative of Legrasse, I made a trip to Providence to see the sculptor and give him the rebuke I thought proper for so boldly imposing upon a learned and aged man. Wilcox still lived alone in the Fleur-de-Lis building in Thomas Street, under the shadow of the finest Georgian steeple in America. I found him at work in his rooms, and at once conceded that his genius is indeed profound and authentic. He will, I believe, sometime be heard from as one of the great decadents, for he has crystallized in clay and will one day mirror in marble those nightmares and fantasies. Dark, frail, and somewhat unkempt, he turned languidly at my knock and asked me my business without rising. When I told him who I was, he displayed some interest, for my uncle had excited his curiosity in probing his strange dreams. I sought with some subtlety to draw him out. In a short time I became convinced of his absolute sincerity, for he spoke of the dreams in a manner none could mistake. They had influenced his art profoundly, and he showed me a morbid statue whose contours almost made me shake. He could not recall having seen the original of this thing except in his own dream, but the outlines had formed themselves insensibly under his hands. It was, no doubt, the great shape he had raved of in his delirium. That he really knew nothing of the hidden cult, save from what my uncle had let slip, he soon made clear. And again I strove to think of some way in which he could possibly have received the weird impressions. He talked of his dreams in a strangely poetic fashion, making me see with terrible vividness the damp cyclopean city of slimy green stone, whose geometry, he oddly said, was all wrong, and heard with frightened expectancy the ceaseless calling from underground, "Cthulhu Phaton! Cthulhu Phaton!" These words had formed part of the dread ritual which told of dead Cthulhu's dream vigil in his stone vault at Raleigh, and I felt deeply moved despite my rational beliefs. Wilcox, I was sure, had heard of the cult in some casual way, and had forgotten it amidst the mass of his equally weird reading and imagining. Later, by virtue of its sheer impressiveness, it had found subconscious expression in dreams, and in the terrible statue I now beheld. The youth was slightly ill-mannered, which I could never like, but I was willing enough to admit both his genius and his honesty. I took leave of him amicably, and wished him all the success his talent promises. The matter of the cult still remained to fascinate me, and at times I had visions of personal fame from researches into its origins and connections. I visited New Orleans, talked with Legrasse and others of that old-time raiding party, and saw the frightful image and even questioned such of the old prisoners as still survived. Old Castro, unfortunately, had been dead for some years. What I now heard so graphically at first hand, though it was really no more than a detailed confirmation of what my uncle had written, excited me afresh, for I felt sure that I was on the track of a very real, very secret, and very ancient religion whose discovery would make me an anthropologist of note. My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were, and I discounted with almost inexplicable perversity the coincidence of the dream notes and odd cuttings collected by Professor Angel. One thing I began to suspect, and which I now fear I know, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront after a careless push from a sailor. I did not forget the marine pursuits of the cult members in Louisiana, and would not be surprised to learn of secret methods and poison needles as ruthless and as anciently known as the cryptic rites and beliefs. Legrasse and his men, it is true, have never been let alone. But in Norway, a certain seaman who saw things is dead. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncle after encountering the sculpture's data have come to sinister ears? I think Professor Angel died because he knew too much, or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go as he did remains to be seen, for I have learned much now.
If heaven ever wishes to grant me a boon, it would be the erasure of the results of mere chance which fixed my eye upon a certain stray piece of paper. It was nothing I would have stumbled upon in the course of my daily round, for it was an old Australian journal, the Sydney Bulletin for April 18, 1925. It had escaped even the Bureau, which had at the time of its issuance been avidly collecting material for my uncle's research. I had given over my inquiries into what Professor Angel called the Cthulhu cult, and was visiting a learned friend in Paterson, New Jersey, the curator of a local museum and a mineralogist of note. Examining one day the reserved specimens roughly set on the storage shelves in a rear room of the museum, my eye was caught by an odd picture in one of the old papers. It was the Sydney Bulletin I have mentioned, for my friend has widespread affiliations, and the picture was a cut of a hideous stone image almost identical to the one Legrasse found in the swamp. Eagerly clearing the sheet, I scanned the item in detail, and was disappointed to find it only of moderate length. What it suggested, however, was of portentous significance to my flagging quest, and I carefully tore it out for immediate action. It read as follows: Mystery derelict found at sea. Vigilant arrives with helpless armed New Zealand yacht in tow. One survivor and dead men found aboard. Tale of desperate battle and deaths at sea. Rescued seaman refuses particulars of strange experience. Odd idol found in his possession. Inquiry to follow. The Morrison Company's freighter Vigilant, bound from Valparaiso, arrived this morning in Darling Harbor, having in tow the disabled but heavily armed steam yacht Alert of Dunedin, New Zealand, which was sighted April 12th, with one man living and one man dead aboard. The Vigilant left Valparaiso March 25th, and on April 2nd was driven considerably south of her course by exceptionally heavy storms and monster waves. On April 12th, the derelict was sighted, and though apparently deserted, was found to contain one survivor in a half-delirious condition, and one man who had evidently been dead for more than a week. The living man was clutching a horrible stone idol of unknown origin, about a foot in height, which the survivor says he found in the cabin of the yacht. The man told an exceedingly strange story of piracy and slaughter. He is Gustaf Johansen, a Norwegian of some intelligence, and had been second mate of the two-masted schooner Emma of Auckland, which sailed for Callao February 20th with 11 men. The Emma, he says, was delayed and thrown widely south by the great storm of March 1st, and on March 2nd encountered the Alert, manned by a queer and evil-looking crew. Being ordered to turn back, Captain Collins refused, whereupon the strange crew began to fire savagely and without warning upon the schooner. With a peculiarly heavy battery of a brass cannon, the Emma's men showed fight, and though the schooner began to sink, they managed to heave alongside their enemy and board her, grappling with the savage crew on the yacht's deck, and being forced to kill them all, the number being slightly superior because of their desperate, though rather clumsy mode of fighting. 3 of the Emma's men were killed, and the remaining 8 under Second Mate Johansen proceeded to navigate the captured yacht.
going ahead in their original direction. The next day they landed on a small island, although none is known to exist in that part of the ocean, and 6 of the men somehow died ashore. Though Johansen is queerly reticent about this part of his story, and speaks only of their falling into a rock chasm. Later, it seems he and 1 companion boarded the yacht, but were beaten about by the storm of April 2nd. From that time till his rescue on the 12th, the man remembers little, and he does not even recall when William Bryden, his companion, died. Bryden's death was probably due to excitement or exposure. Cable advices from Dunedin report that the Alert bore an evil reputation along the waterfront. It was owned by a curious group of half-castes, whose frequent meetings and night trips to the woods attracted no little curiosity, and it had set sail in a great haste just after the storm and earth tremors of March 1st. The Admiralty will institute an inquiry on the whole matter beginning tomorrow, at which every effort will be made to induce Johansen to speak more freely than he has done. What train of ideas it started in my mind! Here were new treasuries of data on the Cthulhu cult, and evidence that it had strange interests at sea as well as on land. What motive prompted the hybrid crew to order back the Emma as they sailed about with their hideous idol? What was the unknown island on which 6 of the Emma's crew had died, and about which the mate Johansen was so secretive? What had the Vice Admiralty's investigation brought out, and what was known of the noxious cult in Dunedin? And most marvelous of all, what deep and more than natural linkage of dates was this which gave a malign and now undeniable significance to the various turns of events so carefully noted by my uncle? February 28th. According to the international date line, the earthquake and storm had come. From Dunedin the Alert had darted eagerly forth, and on the other side of the earth poets and artists had begun to dream of a strange, dank Cyclopean city, whilst a young sculptor had molded in his sleep the form of the dreaded Cthulhu. March 23rd, the crew of the Emma landed on an unknown island, and on that date the dreams of sensitive men assumed a heightened vividness and darkened with dread of a giant monster's malign pursuit, whilst a sculptor had lapsed suddenly into delirium. And what of this storm on April 2nd, the date of which all dreams of the dank city ceased, and Wilcox emerged unharmed from the bondage of strange fever? What of all this, and of those hints of old Castro about the sunken, star-born old ones in their coming reign? Their faithful cult? Was I tottering on the brink of cosmic horrors beyond man's power to bear? If so, they must be horrors of the mind alone, for in some way the 2nd of April had put a stop to whatever monstrous menace had begun its siege of mankind's soul. That evening I bade my host adieu and took a train for San Francisco. In less than a month I was in Dunedin, where, however, I found that little was known of the strange cult members who had lingered in the old sea taverns, though there was vague talk about one inland trip, during which faint drumming and red flame were noticed on the distant hills. In Auckland I learned that Johansen had returned with yellow hair turned white, after a perfunctory and inconclusive questioning at Sydney, and had therefore sold his cottage in West Street and sailed with his wife to his old home in Oslo. Of his stirring experience he would tell his friends no more than he had told the Admiralty officers, and all they could do was to give me his Oslo address. After that I went to Sydney and I saw the Alert, now sold and in commercial use, but gaining nothing from its non-committal bulk. The crouching image with its cuttlefish head, dragon body, scaly wings, and hieroglyphed pedestal was preserved in the museum at Hyde Park, and I studied it long and well, with the same utter mystery and terrible antiquity which I had noted in Legras's smaller specimen. Geologists had found it a monstrous puzzle, for they vowed that the world held no rock like it. Then I thought with a shudder of what old Castro had told Legras about the primal Great Ones. They had come from the stars and had brought their images with them. I now resolved to visit mate Johansen in Oslo. Sailing for London, I re-embarked at once for the Norwegian capital and landed at the Trim Wharves. Johansen's address lay in Oslo. I made the brief trip by taxicab and knocked at the door of a neat and ancient building. A sad-faced woman in black answered, and I was stung with disappointment when she told me in halting English that Gustav Johansen was no more. He had not survived his return. The doings at sea in 1925 had destroyed him. During a walk through a narrow lane near the Gothenburg dock, a bundle of papers falling from an attic window had knocked him down. 2 Lascar sailors at once helped him to his feet, but before the ambulance could reach him, he was dead. Physicians found no adequate cause for the end, and laid it to heart trouble and a weakened constitution. I now felt gnawed at my vitals, accidentally or otherwise. Persuading the widow that my connection with her husband's technical matters was sufficient to entitle me to his manuscript. I bore the document away and began to read it on the London boat. It was a simple, rambling thing, a naive sailor's effort at a post-facto diary, and strove to recall day by day that last awful voyage. I cannot attempt to transcribe it verbatim in all its cloudiness and redundance, but I will tell its gist enough to show why the sound of the water against the vessel's sides became so unendurable to me that I stopped my ears with cotton. Johansen, thank God, did not know quite all, even though he saw the city and the thing. But I shall never sleep calmly again when I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly behind life in time and in space, and of those unhallowed blasphemies from elder stars which dream beneath the sea, known and favored by a nightmare cult, ready and eager to loose them on the world whenever another earthquake shall heave their monstrous stone city again to the sun and air. Johansen's voyage had begun just as he told it. The Emma in ballast had cleared Auckland on February 20th, and had felt the full force of that earthquake-born tempest, which must have heaved up from the sea bottom the horrors that filled men's dreams. Once more under control, the ship was making good progress when held up by the Alert on March 22nd, and I could feel the mate's regret as he wrote of her bombardment and sinking. Of swarthy cult fiends on the Alert he speaks with significant horror. There was some peculiarly abominable quality about them, and Johansen shows ingenious wonder at the charge of ruthlessness brought against his party during the proceedings of the court inquiry. Then, driven ahead by curiosity in their captured yacht, under Johansen's command, the men sight a great stone pillar sticking out of the sea, and then come up upon a coastline of mingled mud, ooze, and weedy cyclopean masonry, which can be nothing less than the tangible substance of Earth's supreme terror, the nightmare corpse city of R'lyeh, that was built in measureless aeons behind history by the vast, loathsome shapes that seep down from the dark stars. There lay great Cthulhu and his hordes, hidden in green, slimy vaults, and sending out at last, after cycles incalculable, the thoughts that spread fear to the dreams of the sensitive, and called imperiously to the faithful to come on a pilgrimage of liberation and restoration. All this Johansen did not suspect, but God knows he soon saw enough. I suppose that only a single mountaintop, the hideous monolith-crowned citadel whereupon great Cthulhu was buried, actually emerged from the waters. When I think of the extent of all that may be brooding down there, I almost wish to kill myself forthwith. Johansen and his men were awed by the cosmic majesty of this dripping Babylon of elder daemons, and must have guessed without guidance that it was nothing of this or any sane planet. Awe at the unbelievable size of the greenish stone blocks, at the dizzying height of the great carven monolith, and at the stupefying identity of the colossal statues, and with the queer image found in the shrine on the Alert, is poignantly visible in every line of the mate's frightened description. Without knowing what futurism is like, Johansen achieved something very close to it when he spoke of the city. For instead of describing any definite structure or building, he dwells only on broad impressions of vast angles and stone surfaces. Surfaces too great to belong to anything right or proper for this earth, and impious with horrible images and hieroglyphs. I mention his talk about angles because it suggests something Wilcox had told me of his awful dreams. He said that the geometry of the dream place he saw was abnormal, non-elucidin, and loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. Now an unlettered seaman felt the same thing whilst gazing at the terrible reality. Johansen and his men landed at a sloping mud bank on this monstrous acropolis and clambered slipperily up over tightened oozy blocks which could have been no mortal staircase. The very sun of heaven seemed distorted when viewed through the polarizing miasma, welling out of the sea-soaked perversion, and twisted menace and suspense lurked leeringly in those crazily elusive angles of carven rock where a second glance showed concavity after the first showed convexity. Something very like fright had come over all the explorers before anything more definitive than rock and ooze and weed was seen. Each would have fled had he not feared the scorn of the others, and it was only half-heartedly that they searched, vainly, as it proved, for some portable souvenir to bear away. It was Rodriguez, the Portuguese, who climbed up the foot of the monolith and shouted of what he had found. The rest followed him and looked curiously at the immense carved door with the now familiar squid dragon statue. It was, Johansen said, like a great barn door, and they all felt that it was a door because of the ornate lintel, threshold, and jambs around it, though they could not decide whether it lay flat like a trapdoor or slantwise like an outside cellar door. As Wilcox would have said, the geometry of the place was all wrong. One could not be sure that the sea and the ground were horizontal, hence the relative position of everything else seeming phantasmally variable. Bryden pushed at the stone in several places without result. Then Donovan felt over it delicately around the edge, pressing each point separately as he went. He climbed interminably along the grotesque stone molding. That is, one would call it climbing if the thing was not after all horizontal. And the men wondered how any door in the universe could be so vast. Then, very softly and very slowly, the acre-great panel began to give inward at the top, and they saw that it was balanced. Donovan slid, or somehow propelled himself down, or along the jamb and rejoined his fellows, and everyone watched the queer recession of the monstrously carven portal. In this fantasy of prismatic distortion it moved anonymously, in a diagonal way, so that all the rules of matter and perspective seemed upset. The aperture was black with a darkness almost material. That tenebrousness was indeed a positive quality, for it obscured such parts of the inner wall as ought to have been revealed, and actually burst forth like smoke from its aeon-long imprisonment, visibly darkening the sun as it slunk away into the shrunken and gibbous sky on flapping, membranous wings. The odor arising from the newly opened depths was intolerable, and at length the quick-eared Hawkins thought he heard a nasty, slopping sound down there, and everyone was listening still when it lumbered slobberingly into sight and gropingly squeezed its gelatinous green immensity through the black doorway into the tainted outside air of that poisoned city of madness. Poor Johansen's handwriting almost gave out when he wrote of this. Of the 6 men who never reached the ship, he thinks 2 perished of pure fright in that accursed instant. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. A mountain walked or stumbled. God! What wonder that across the earth the great architect went mad, and poor Wilcox raved with fever in that telepathic instant. The thing of the idols, the green, sticky spawn of the stars had awakened to claim his own. The stars were right again, and what an age-old cult had failed to do by design, a band of innocent sailors had done by accident. After vigtillions of years, great Cthulhu was loose again, and ravening for delight. 3 men were swept up by the flabby claws before anybody turned. God rest them, if there be any rest in the universe. They were Donovan, Guerrera, and Angstrom. Parker slipped as the other 3 were plunged frenziedly over endless vistas of green-crusted rock to the boat, and Johansen swears he was swallowed up by an angle of masonry which shouldn't have been there. An angle which was acute, but behaved as if it were obtuse. so only Bryden and Johansen reached the boat and pulled desperately for the Alert as the mountainous monstrosity flopped down the slimy stones and hesitated, floundering at the edge of the water. Steam had not been suffered to go down entirely, despite the departure of all hands for the shore, and it was the work of only a few moments of feverish rushing up and down between wheel and engines to get the Alert underway. Slowly, amidst the distorting horrors of that indescribable scene, she began to churn the lethal waters, whilst on the masonry of that charnel shore that was not of earth, the Titan thing from the stars slavered and gibbered like Polypheme, cursing the fleeing ship of Odysseus. Then, bolder than the storied Cyclops, great Cthulhu slid greasily into the water and began to pursue with vast wave-rising strokes of cosmic potency. Bryden looked back and went mad, laughing shrilly as he kept on laughing at intervals till death found him one night in the cabin, whilst Johansen was wandering deliriously. But Johansen had not given out yet. Knowing that the thing could surely overtake the Alert until steam was fully up, he resolved on a desperate chance, and setting the engine for full speed, ran lightning-like on deck and reversed the wheel. There was a mighty eddying and foaming in the noisome brine, and as the steam mounted higher and higher, the brave Norwegian drove his vessel head-on against the pursuing jelly, which rose above the unclean froth like the stern of a Damon galleon. The awful squid head with rising feelers came nearly up to the bowsprit of the sturdy yacht, but Johansen drove on relentlessly. There was a bursting as of an exploding bladder, a slushy nastiness as of a cloven sunfish, a stench as of 1,000 open graves, and a sound that the chronicler would not put on paper. For an instant the ship was befouled by an acrid and blinding green cloud, and then there was only a venomous seething astern, where, God in heaven, the scattered placidity of that nameless sky spawn was nebulously recombining in its hateful original form, whilst its distance widening every second as the Alert gained impetus from its mounting steam. That was all. After that, Johansen only brooded over the idol in the cabin and attended to a few matters of food for himself and the laughing maniac by his side. He did not try to navigate after the first bold flight, for the reaction had taken something out of his soul. Then came the storm of April 2nd, and a gathering of clouds about his consciousness. There is a sense of spectral whirling through liquid gulfs of infinity, of dizzying rides through reeling universes on a comet's tail, and of hysterical plunges from the pit to the moon, and from the moon back again to the pit, all livened by a chorus of the distorted, hilarious elder gods and the green bat-winged mocking imps of Tartarus. Out of that dream came rescue from the vigilant. He could not tell. They would think him mad. He would write of what he knew before death came. Death would be a boon, if only it could blot out the memories. That was the document I read, and now I have placed it in the tin box beside the statue and the papers of Professor Angel. With it shall go this record of mine, this test of my own sanity, wherein is pieced together that which I hoped may never be pieced together again. I have looked upon all that the universe has to hold of horror, and even the skies of spring and the flowers of summer must ever afterward be poison to me. But I do not think my life will be long. As my uncle went, as poor Johansen went, so shall I go. I know too much, and the cult still lives. Cthulhu still lives too, I suppose, again in that chasm of stone which has shielded him since the sun was young. His accursed city is sunken once more, for the vigilance sailed over the spot after the April storm, but his ministers on earth still bellow and prance and slay around idol-capped monoliths in lonely places. He must have been trapped by the sinking whilst within his black abyss, or else the world would by now be screaming with fright and frenzy. Who knows the end? What has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise. Loathsomeness waits and dreams in the deep, and decay spreads over the tottering cities of men. A time will come, but I must not and cannot think. Let me pray that, if I do not survive this manuscript, My executors may put caution before audacity and see that it meets no other eye.